Hunger and gender inversion. I have attempted to demonstrate, up to this point, that when we talk about male rape and, more broadly, homoeroticism during slavery, we are implicitly addressing power in the forms of gender, sex, and corporeality. The open-ended nature of Luke's example, the resolute meanings we can never fully achieve from his body, sex, and gender, presents both a challenge and a number of theoretical potentials. We can marshal these potentials and apply them to a broader understanding of motherhood, consumption, hunger, and resistance in Jacobs's narrative and 19th-century American culture in general. Luke's incomplete story and the incomplete record of homoeroticism within the historical record coincides with a relentless drive within African American history and letters to achieve completion, or at least to convey completion at the levels of gender, sex, and body. It is as if, this whole time, we have striven against the possibility of a body that is part machine and part corporeal entity. I am referring to the body meshed into the cotton gin, the body that is part machine, part rot, part torso. In Luke, this thread of disfigurement takes the form of reversed paternal/child roles and body parts that are so disfigured that we can ascertain their shapes and shadowy forms only through discourses of filth, despotism, and a restraining, sentimental silence. What would it mean, though, to think about Jacobs in particular and black womanhood and maternity more broadly as incomplete frameworks? What I mean here by incomplete is this: what if they did not fully and neatly facilitate ideas of racial uplift or of female reproductivity as saving? What if Jacobs did not construct black femininity to complement the sufferings and subjectivity of black male patriarchs? More broadly, what would be that model of black femininity that did not respond, that did not correct, ideas of black taint and licentiousness? Through these questions, what I am attempting to convey is that in rendering, say, Jacobs's personal genealogy as a political response, albeit to repressive forces, we miss out on her hunger, we miss out on a fuller understanding of her sexuality, as opposed to her reproductive capacity. Jacobs's sexuality, above and beyond the significance of motherhood and reproductive capacity, has become increasingly more important to ascertain. Yet her sexuality, outside of maternity, is rarely given full treatment within black feminist and feminist scholarship more broadly. What would it mean to break open, pry apart, and hold in a kind of suspended animation the very infrastructures that have allowed us to pursue a relatively complete understandings of maternity, female genealogy, and sexuality, for example, in Jacobs's narrative and in slave culture more broadly? In terms of infrastructures, what comes most readily to mind is the logic of gender and sex operating through recollections of sexual abuse in Jacobs's narrative. Summing up this system, Jacobs writes, "It makes the white fathers cruel and sensual, the sons violent and licentious, it contaminates the daughters, and makes the wives wretched." To break it down further, Jacobs plots sons on the plantation as coming under the unclean influences of their fathers. This leads them to rape young black women. Daughters hear of their father's sexual indiscretions, which leads them also to rape and violate. The daughters' curiosity is excited, and they soon learn the cause. They are attended by the young slave girls whom their father has corrupted, and they hear such talk as should never meet youthful ears, or any other ears. They know that the women slaves are subject to their father's authority in all things, and in some cases they exercise the same authority over the men slaves. And wives, as more or less helpless victims, respond wretchedly to their husbands' inattentions. In the narrative, a good example of this is Mrs. Flint's crimsoning and weeping as she as Jacobs relate to her all of the lurid details of her husband's sexual advances. Missing from this matrix of sexual desire are any references to homoeroticism. In presenting this dynamic, Jacobs presumes that the father's desire runs one way, from male to female, and that all other desires conform to this rule. With Luke, though, we have a clear example of this not being the case. Luke's master embodies a genealogy of white male desire that runs across, betwixt, and between gender and sex norms. In Luke, the master satiates maternal as well as paternal needs, the young slave representing nativity, home space, and a site of pastoral pleasure. Luke's body and body parts traverse feminine as well as masculine physicality. Not to mention the master, who simultaneously plays the roles of needy child, parasite, and adult tyrant. Jacobs's narrative is the story of black maternity and womanhood. It is a story centrally concerned with evasion and pursuit, the master pursuer and the enslaved young woman who constantly evades her pursuer. In order for the narrative of pursuit to work, gender and sex have to stand still while a framework of erotic desire stemming from the plantation master takes center stage. Ironically, Jacobs reifies the white male paternity that she seeks to displace and from which she endeavors to disentangle herself through a sexual logic in which the master is always the central node, giving meaning and motility to all other erotic desires on the plantation. Through this model, we can never get it or make sense of Dr. Flint's playing the role of male mother to Jacobs or his wife simulating mock intercourse with the young slave girl. Such fluid expressions of gender complicate and challenge our base presumptions about the master's masculinity and belie an altogether different framing of desire. And even if we were to accept that the patriarch was the center and that daughters raped black men, that still does not account for the erotic dynamics between white women and their black female nursemaids, mammies, aunties, and playmates. Before black men, white women had access to black women and black girls. They learned to eroticize and sexualize black women and girls in ways that often had little to do with the sex drives of fathers and brothers. This is not to say that white women did not rape and entice black men on the plantation, they did. But what I am most concerned with is how Jacobs and history on the whole have tended to overlook the most obvious and more primary level of erotic interaction for white women, the relationships between white and black women. More and more texts are emerging that document the relationships among women on the plantation, between white and black women and between black women in their own communal settings. However, from general studies such as Elizabeth Fox Genovese's Within the Plantation Household, Black and White Women of the Old South, 1988, to Marley F. Weiner's Mistresses and Slaves, Plantation Women in South Carolina, 1830–1880, 1998, to Deborah Gray White's focus on the black female in R&TI A Woman, Female Slaves in the Plantation South, 1985, the subject of eroticism among women on the plantation remains largely untreated. I mentioned in the previous chapter on Douglas that the only text that I know of to make overt reference to sexual dynamics between women on the plantation is Nell Irvin Painter's Sojourner Truth, A Life, A Symbol. Offering some insight into why black women at the time said virtually nothing about sexual abuse at the hands of women, Painter writes. Truth had two motives for keeping secrets by the time she told her story. Having come through a libel trial in the mid-1830s, she was concerned about her credibility. She also feared that because what had happened to her was so unaccountable, so unreasonable, and what is usually called so unnatural, readers who were uninitiated would not believe her. Connecting the uninitiated of the past to the uninitiated of the present, Painter confirms that then, as now, the sexual abuse of young women by men is deplored but recognized as common. Less easily acknowledged, then and now, is the fact that there are women who violated children. We can only speculate about the extent to which shame and the emphasis upon reason and nature have kept from us these deeper realities of black female experience. White women speaking about the hard facts of slavery risked being thought of as sexually licentious or, even worse, as unsexed. For black women, the risk was even greater as whites de facto linked their sexuality with African wilds, physical disfigurement, and the horses, dogs, and other domestic animals to which Thomas Jefferson compared blacks in his Notes on the State of Virginia. In Jacobs's own life, her grandmother serves as an object of white female desire, eroticization, nurturing, and consumptive appetites. Long before Dr. Flint comes into the picture, marrying Jacobs's mistress, selling her grandmother, and pursuing the young Jacobs as his concubine, Mrs. Flint has learned from elderly women in her family about the erotic utility of and serviceability of the black woman. The scene that culminates this history is another bedroom scenario that calls to mind a number of the dynamics that play out in Luke's abuse. Jacobs's mistress, like Luke's master, confines the younger black woman to a room adjoining her bedroom. As with Luke, expectations of sacrifice and service fuel sexualized brutality. And also, similar to the Luke scenario, appetite and hunger enable a fluid sense of gender and sexuality. Let me describe the significant details of the scenario before correlating it further with Luke's abuse and an overarching dynamic of black female consumption. Motivated by jealousy and humiliation, Mrs. Flint takes Jacobs into her bedroom. Her actions, according to Jacobs, are a knee-jerk reaction to her husband's sexual pursuit of the young slave girl. She pulls her aside, hands her a Bible and says, "Lay your hand on your heart, kiss this holy book, and swear before God that you tell me the truth being that Jacobs has not succumbed to the sexual advancements of Flint." At this point in the narrative, Mrs. Flint, consumed by her erotic obsessions, comes to fixate on Jacobs. She imagines Jacobs as a seductress, assumes her guilt before the young woman can prove her innocence, and then wants all of the sordid details, which cause Mrs. Flint to alternately blush, weep, groan, and moan. She seems to blame Jacobs for her degraded state. Jacobs imagines Mrs. Flint as a byproduct of her husband's desire. She paints her as powerless and pitiable. Yet it is my contention that Mrs. Flint is the perfect portrait of what Morrison has described as the reckless, unabated power of a white woman gathering identity unto herself from the wholly available and serviceable lives of Africanist others. The deeper issue, within the confessional confines of the bedroom, is not Flint's pursuit of Jacobs or vice versa, but the utter powerlessness of this white woman who receives neither love, devotion, nor any semblance of affection from her cruel, predatory husband. Jacobs does her best to render the white woman an unpitiable, compassionate light in this particular moment, but everywhere else in the narrative suggests that her situation is endemic to the culture of consumption. These facts I will take up shortly. For the moment, we have Mrs. Flint convinced that Jacobs tells the truth regarding her husband. To thwart his sexual schemes, she takes Jacobs to sleep in a room adjoining her own. Jacobs imagines in her mistress a saving presence. However, her feelings of safety and saving are short-lived, as Mrs. Flint begins a nightly vigil that terrifies the young girl and causes her to fear for her life. Sometimes I woke up, and found her bending over me. At other times she whispered in my ear, as though it was her husband who was speaking to me, and listened to hear what I would answer. If she startled me, on such occasions, she would glide stealthily away. At last, I began to be fearful for my life. It had been often threatened, and you can imagine, better than I can describe, what an unpleasant sensation it must produce to wake up in the dead of night and find a jealous woman bending over you. Deborah M. Garfield finds the positioning of the women's bodies sexually suggestive. She refers to the mistress as performing mock intercourse with Jacobs. Garfield describes Mrs. Flint alternately as a stand-in for her husband, a type of male impersonator, and enacting a role reversal that stems back to Flint, the patriarch and motivating figure within the incestuous plantation household. Garfield explains Jacobs's motives for her depiction of this scenario as an attempt to replicate the sexual act and to block her reader from its reality. This scenario, according to Garfield, is yet another example of Jacobs's following child's instruction and foreclosing sexual details that would offend and taint her female reader. The bottom line? Mrs. Flint's imitations are still grounded in her husband's physical and discursive presence. My only problem with Garfield's provocative analysis is that it denies the deeper meaning of Mrs. Flint's erotic proximity, her sexual fantasies about Jacobs, and her sexual agency independent of her husband. Garfield's analysis adheres religiously to the schema I referenced earlier of erotic desire originating in the white patriarch and informing that of the son, daughter, and wife. The meaning of the mistress's transgendered behavior is for Garfield an esoteric occurrence that underscores how in the master-slave dialectic, roles can be mystically exchanged in narrative but never permanently escaped. In other words, the specter of the master's hunger and desire is always present, animating and acting through his wife, who inexplicably takes on his voice and sexual appetites. All this perceived effort, though, to disguise Dr. Flint's desire and presence makes no sense, given, as Painter points out, that the sexual abuse of women by their masters was a commonly noted occurrence. I submit that what has truly mystified and defied articulation has been female sexuality under slavery and, in particular, erotic ties between black and white women. Painter's comments about Sojourner Truth's situation apply as well to Jacobs, which is that to call attention to the homoerotic interests of white mistresses would have undermined the ethos of black women's claims to motherhood and womanhood. The motherhood and womanhood even of the plantation mistress had to remain pristine and inviolate if the thesis of patriarchal desire as the primary corrupter of female innocence was to apply. In the reality that Jacobs foregrounds, white women did not corrupt white women or learn to eroticize black women through primary relations with mammies and other caretaker figures. Painter notes that less easily acknowledged, then and now, is the fact that there are women who violate children. Yet with the plantation conceived of by whites as a household and blacks always as infantilized and eroticized infants, how could the mistress not find herself seduced by this sex/power dynamic that was reinforced everywhere around her? As Morrison asserts, how could she not hunger, become reckless, and learn through osmosis the process of gathering identity unto herself from the completely available and expendable resource of the female chattel slave? Beyond the basic issues of sex and violation, Morrison finds in the white mistress/female slave dialectic the coordinates of an intensely important moral debate. Morrison's observations call to mind the 19th-century debate about Christian cannibalism. Such a notion did not easily translate into concept and terminology. By the late 1800s, White identity on the plantation was so deeply wedded to unspeakable practices of consumption that whites themselves could not see and therefore could not name the specter and terror of the emerging white civilized cannibal. Even the idea of child molestation forwarded by Painter does not convey the dynamic overlay of consumption upon sex, of consumptive hungers driving the erotic interchange between Mrs. Flint and Jacobs. We cannot separate Mrs. Flint in the bedroom, acting as both master and mistress, from Mrs. Flint the parasite and consumer practiced in the methodology of slave consumption. Mrs. Flint was well versed in the language and ideology of consumption. She threatened her slaves with skin peeling and pickling. She spit in all of the pots after the cook had finished the big house meal in order to prevent the cook or any other slave from eking out their meager fare with the remains of the gravy and other scrapings. She rationed out the food and starved her slaves as a means of maintaining psychic and emotional control. Providing further insight into her character, Jacobs observes, Mrs. Flynn, like many Southern women, was totally deficient in energy. She had not strength to superintend her household affairs, but her nerves were so strong, that she could sit in her easy chair and see a woman whipped, till the blood trickled from every stroke of the lash. Mrs. Flint lacks power and vitality yet strongly demonstrates these traits in the context of the torture and subjugation of black females. For women like Mrs. Flynn, the plantation was a spiritual and emotional wasteland. Such women hungered and even starved for the affections and attentions of their husbands. They learned to harden and deaden themselves to physical and psychological abuses and furthermore, in the context of such brutalities, developed a method of nurturing and sustaining themselves by drawing upon the erotic and psychic energy of black women. In the bedroom scenario, Mrs. Flynn takes Jacobs into her special care. She channels her sexual frustration regarding her husband, her jealousy and hatred, into nightly vigils, into rituals of erotic interchange that usually end with whispers and Jacobs' awakening to the woman leaning over her in the dead of night. Jacobs feels an unnamed terror. At last, she says, I began to be fearful for my life. It had been often threatened. Terrible as this experience was, I had fears that it would give place to one more terrible. Sex and consumption fueled Dr. Flint's constant threats against Jacobs' life. Similarly, with Mrs. Flynn, the threat of death commingled with sex, so that we cannot know for sure if the terrible act that Jacobs imagines is molestation and rape at the hands of the mistress beating her to death, or death by some other heinous, unspeakable means. The point is that we do not have to know the particulars to understand how thoroughly interwoven is this moment with same-sex eroticism and with a socially sanctioned white female hunger and appetite. Jacobs locates the roots of all this in the Good Doctor and in plantation patriarchy. However, the problem with Dr. Flint's desire, male, patriarchal desire, as the glue that holds all of this together is that his example overshadows and inhibits our access to more central domestic operations. More specifically, I am thinking of the intimate female-centered ways in which a woman such as Mrs. Flint learns to objectify and erotically consume a black woman slave. Replacing Flint with someone like Jacobs' grandmother would take us a lot further in recovering Mrs. Flint's learned practices of social consumption. Aunt Marthy, Jacob's grandmother, does not stand out in the narrative as someone who suffers from social consumption. As Jacobs struggles for her life, this elderly black woman is free, a landowner and property owner, and is considered an upstanding member of the community. In her goodness, of moral character and domestic practices, Aunt Marthy seems to be in no way connected to the cruelty, meanness, and consumptive urges of Jacobs' mistress. Aunt Marthy is the typical good grandmother from black antebellum experience. Moses Roper describes in his slave narrative how his grandmother comes into the slave cabin and saves him in childhood from the murdering knife of the slave mistress. In Douglas's narrative, the caring, sustaining black grandmother replaces the absent mother. So, too, in Jacobs's narrative does the grandmother come to represent the whole of black maternity. She, even better than the mother, helps establish racial continuity, maternity, and female virtue as inherent phenomena. Both Jacobs and our editor/benefactress, Lydia Maria Child, seized upon the idea of the good grandmother as a way of refuting northern white women's ideas of black women as bad, unclean, and natally dead. Child even published an excerpt of Jacobs' narrative under the title The Good Grandmother in her 1865 text The Freedman's Book. Jacobs's grandmother fits the typical role of the mammy figure, a nurturing black woman beloved by all who could do anything, and do it better than anyone else. Because of her expertise in all domestic matters, she was the premier house servant and all others were her subordinates. Whites in the community refer to the grandmother as Auntie and Mammy. Underlying all of the goodness and affection associated with the mammy was an undercurrent of cruelty and self-sacrifice from which young white women, such as Mrs. Flynn, benefited. For it was implicitly understood that, unlike that of the Jezebel, the role of the mammy displaced sexuality into nurture and transformed potential hostility into sustenance and love. Devoid of sexuality, the mammy served as a font of nurturing. She was the perfect emotional playground, the perfect vehicle through which young white women could work out and practice their need, their sexual hostility, and other types of aggression. Mrs. Flint learns in the suckling stage of her development this utilitarian purpose of the mammy figure. Years and generations later, it still pains Aunt Marthy that while nursing her female child she had to take her own baby from her breast to nourish his wife, Mrs. Flint. Even when Mrs. Flint is dismissive of Jacobs's grandmother, not greeting her when she passes her in the street, the black woman, because of her abiding maternal feelings, cannot completely disconnect from the white woman. Jacobs relates that such public treatment wounded my grandmother's feelings, for she could not retain ill will against the woman whom she had nourished with her milk when a babe. Jacobs's grandmother and Mrs. Flint have an entirely different expectation of the maternal bond that binds them. Mrs. Flint's nurturing in infancy is intrinsically tied to the starvation of an emotional denial of the slave. Her spitting in pots, denying food to her cook and her cook's children, are gestures that reflect the dominion of her white womanhood and the kindred tie that she has learned from her mother, her aunts, and at the breast of Aunt Marthy. Mrs. Flint's mother, while more subtle and refined in her appetites, maintains rituals of social consumption that devolve upon the black mammy figure. By the time we encounter Jacobs's grandmother in the narrative, she is a free woman. Her freedom from slavery is not so much given as it is earned through back-breaking labor and sacrifice. She does her plantation chores as well as additional baking, washing, and other jobs in order to save up money to purchase her freedom and that of family members. Before her mistress dies, the elderly white woman borrows $300 from Aunt Marthy to purchase a silver candelabra. She promises to pay the money back and to free Aunt Marthy upon her death. She never pays the money back and only frees the black woman after she has died and has no further use of her. Her will and testament reflects her promise to free Aunt Marthy, but Dr. Flint does not honor the will. Instead, he puts the grandmother up for sale at a private auction. Adding insult to injury, he also keeps the silver candelabra as part of his personal cache of precious household wares. Jacobs paints a classic sentimental scene around the selling of her grandmother. When the day of sale came, she took her place among the chattels, and at the first call she sprang upon the auction block. Many voices called out, "Shame! Shame! Who is going to sell you, Aunt Marthy? Don't stand there. That is no place for you." Without saying a word, she quietly awaited her fate. No one bid for her. At last, a feeble voice said, $50. It came from a maiden lady, 70 years old, the sister of my grandmother's deceased mistress. She had lived 40 years under the same roof with my grandmother. She knew how faithfully she had served her owners, and how cruelly she had been defrauded of her rights, and she resolved to protect her. Miss Fanny purchases the black woman for the extremely low price of $50. Jacobs casts white women such as Miss Fanny and her sister in the role of protectresses, as honorable, keepers of their word, good, conscionable, and ladylike. The author has little to say of the silver candelabra purchased with the money saved by an enslaved woman to purchase her freedom and that of her children. For the sake of her white female readership, Jacobs emphasizes instead the good intentions of the deceased mistress and the system of self-sacrifice and reward that ultimately secures the freedom of Aunt Marthy. Flint serves as a type of pressure valve through which Jacobs filters all of the contradiction and irony of the grandmother's predicament. He is the executor of the elder white woman's will, he keeps the candelabra, and he advertises the selling of Jacobs's grandmother. Flint fits seamlessly into this role, since we have already come to associate him with greed and extreme sexual appetite. Yet we should not too hastily separate the refinement and good taste of Aunt Marthy's mistress from the social consumption of the black mammy. If Flint is a despot and pariah, then it is his wife's affluence and her deceased grandmother's wealth that infuses and animates his desires. By law, Jacobs and her children belong to Flint's wife. While Flint is brash and blatant, his appetites and devouring nature pronounced throughout the narrative, the consumptive drives of the deceased white mistress remain cloaked in finery and social affluence. The silver candelabra serves as an emblem of her good taste, an article recognized in the domestic sphere as beautiful, tasteful, and feminine. In this way, the grandmother's labor and state of enslavement feed into and sustain this white woman's self-esteem and domestic virtue. The characteristics of self-sacrifice and self-negation typically ascribed to the mammy facilitate this white woman in fulfilling her fantasies of material well-being and social finery. Jacobs's configuration of the goodly black grandmother and the beneficent white female does not readily reveal the ties of consumption binding the black grandmother to her mistress. In Jacobs's version of her history, she encourages us to perceive no connection between the acquired high cultural tastes of Mrs. Flint's grandmother and Mrs. Flint starving her of slaves and hovering over Jacobs at night in a sexually suggestive manner. The nursing of the young white mistress in infancy apparently has nothing to do with the institutionalized starving of the black woman's children on the plantation. To clarify, I am not suggesting that we replace the good with the bad, recasting Mrs. Flint's grandmother, for example, as the bad white woman who does not free her slave and steals the money the black woman has saved to purchase her freedom. What I am urging is a more complex understanding of the good, of the fact that we cannot divorce a white slave mistress's good intentions from the spiritual depravity and practices of social consumption that shaped her. I have no doubt that Mrs. Flint's mother cared deeply for Aunt Martha. Neither do I doubt the affections of the larger white community, whom she supplied with crackers and preserves and who respected her intelligence and good character. The whites who yell out shame. Shame. Who is going to sell you, Aunt Marthy? Don't stand there. That is no place for you. Have grown up at the nurturing breast and spoon of Aunt Marthy? Like the well-shined silver candelabra, she is a familiar and valued fixture in their emotional and psychic worlds. They imagine her a surrogate mother, familiar, and relative, and hence, the spectacle of the black woman on the auction block shocks them. Mary Prince, a black woman who experienced slavery around the same time, likened the auction block to the butcher block. Standing for auction, as I have mentioned once, she recalls, I was soon surrounded by strange men, who examined and handled me in the same manner a butcher would a calf or a lamb he was about to purchase, and who talked about my shape and size in like words, as if I could no more understand their meaning than the dumb beasts. The whites imagine Aunt Martha as separate and apart from the economy of human consumption that Prince describes. What they seem to not realize, though, is that their regard for the mammy's self-sacrifice and overbrimming goodness serve only to oil and ease the machinery of consumption. What I am attempting to tease out through this auction block scene is the difference between the institution of consumption and the intimate human ties that fueled and enabled this system. It was one thing for whites to construct gurneys and rope ties or to literally feed a slave into a machine, such as the cotton gin. And it was an altogether different matter for them to feel, as one Kentucky slave master felt, a sense of enjoyment and completion in the consumption of the slave. We have already observed that, after literally butchering and cooking his slave's quartered body over an open fire, this Kentucky slave owner reported to his wife that he had never enjoyed himself so well at a ball as he had enjoyed himself that evening. I am not equating the whites gathered around the auction block with the heinousness of this particular slave master. This man was more insane than most and later committed suicide. Yet his example of acquiring a taste for the Negro is instructive. It demonstrates, in the extreme, how whites within a culture of consumption could not help but develop tastes, affections, and high cultural values rooted in the chattel slave. I see little difference between the Kentucky slave owner who associates the butchering and cooking of flesh with ballroom refinery and the whites gathered around the auction block associating sacred maternal feelings with a black woman who is at base an owned object, a utilitarian repository of their infantile memories and needs. It is the good in these whites and not the bad that completes the circuit, the logic of need and self-denial that undergirds mechanisms of consumption. Without the intimate, feel-good tie between the mammy and her white progeny, there could be no psychic and spiritual consumption. And without ideological and symbolic structures intended to validate the mammy's consumption, there could be no sanity in this essentially inverted reality, which is why, getting back to the bedroom interactions between Mrs. Flint and Jacobs, we need different structures of erotic desire, gender, and intimacy to help us make a broader sense of slave experience within this essentially unstable and hunger-driven context. We cannot get from here to there, to an understanding of the masculine mistress or of Jacobs's fears of death and sexual violation, through models of gender and sex that always privilege the patriarch and the male/female conjugal union as natural and originary states. Mrs. Flint does not simulate masculinity, as some have suggested, nor does she simulate the master's erotic desire and dominion. She is masculine. She is aggressor and predator. She comes naturally by a restless, craving, vicious nature that causes her to rove about, like her husband, day and night, seeking whom to devour. Her masculine drive originates in the domestic sphere, a fact that goes against usual ways of thinking about the feminine as linked to the domestic realm and about masculinity as originating within the male body and the male sexual drive. Describing Mrs. Flint as whispering in her husband's voice and adopting his erotic mindset is as close as Jacobs can safely come to asserting that Mrs. Flint is male, acting male, seeming to her senses and sensibilities to be male. Such discussion of a male type of female was risky, as it could be easily used to support commonly held notions of women as hungering and disfigured and black women, in particular, as sexually knowledgeable, monstrous, and devouring. Social conventions limited Jacobs, as did her reliance upon a pristine, untainted model of womanhood. However, these discursive limitations upon Jacobs need not restrict our exploration of gender variance in the narrative. Mrs. Flint's masculinity makes greater sense when we think about her through the ideology of slave consumption. Mrs. Flint's male behaviors serve as an index for appetite and consumptive capacity. Jacobs understands slavery as sexual ravishment and sexual ravishment as a process that facilitates the consumption of the female slave. She lays out this ideology when she speaks of Dr. Flint as hungering and devouring and as one who consistently channels these appetites into acts of sexual domination. More than anything, Mrs. Flint hungers like a man, a fact that shocks and terrifies Jacobs as she lies beneath her mistress in the dead of night. Only through this deeper understanding of and contextualization of masculinity can we understand how important an intrinsic hunger and consumption are to the white female's gender and domestic identity. We might even say, in a way that scholars up to this point have not allowed, that hunger and appetite are constitutive of gender and sex within the plantation context. Does hunger then come before sex and gender, or do the former categories come before the latter? It is a question that merits extensive examination beyond the purview of this study. I point out the correlation between hunger and gender categorizations only so that we might understand how the masculinity of the mistress is a significant point of fact. As opposed to being a male mask, the mistress's male identity is more a reflection of an intrinsic consumptive capacity that we cannot otherwise get at within the lexicon of 19th-century gender roles. Not just in Mrs. Flint but in other slave owners we find hunger depicted as fluid, mutable, and able to conform to myriad social conventions. In other parts of the narrative, Jacobs documents plantation mistresses who taunt and pursue their female slaves with the might of a man. Even Flint does not operate out of a strict sense of patriarchal authority. At one point, he writes to Jacobs in the guise of a slave mistress. He wants her to voluntarily return home after having escaped from the plantation. He entreats, "The family will be rejoiced to see you, and your poor old grandmother expressed a great desire to have you come, when she heard your letter read. In her old age she needs the consolation of having her children round her." Adding another layer of sentimentality to his maternal voice, Flint describes an all-night vigil at the bedside of Jacobs's dying aunt. "Could you have seen us round her deathbed, with her mother, all mingling our tears in one common stream, you would have thought the same heartfelt tie existed between a master and his servant as between a mother and her child." Flint manipulates the consumptive currency of the black mammy. He plays upon Jacobs's mother loss and mother hunger, hoping to entice her back through her unrequited needs. Explaining the correlation between emotional and physical starvation and sexual ravishment, Jacobs reveals that the slave girl is reared in an atmosphere of licentiousness and fear. When she is 14 or 15, her owner, or his sons, or the overseer, or perhaps all of them, begin to bribe her with presents. If these fail to accomplish their purpose, she is whipped or starved into submission to their will. When we figure hunger centrally into the equation of gender and sex in the narrative, what we presume to know about certain normative realms of experience gives way to a fluid uncertainty. How are we to make sense of masters who speak in the voices of young mistresses? And to what extent can we rely upon a patriarchal model of consumption when women such as Mrs. Flint's grandmother anticipate and enable the consumptive passions of her son-in-law, Dr. Flint? Male mothers and female masters. I began this discussion of gender variance and the master's Epicurean hungers with the example of Luke. By beginning with Luke and an exploration of his gender and sexual ambiguity and then tracking similar findings in Jacobs's life and circumstances, my intention was to denude us of certain binary logics and relationships, man/woman, black female abolitionist/white female abolitionist, master/mistress, and reproductive/neutered, among others. In response to my own question about how to make sense of Flint as a male grandmother and the inherently masculine appetites of Mrs. Flint, I think that we need to begin from an implied zero ground, the unstable sex, gender, and corporeality of the slave. In the context of Jacobs's slave narrative, The Flint's gender fluidity rests upon the bedrock of gender and sex presumptions attributed to the body and person of the slave. Both Jacobs and Luke, I have labored to prove, embody this central dynamic of gender and sex instability in their relationships to abusive masters and within same-sex erotic scenarios that define normative schemas of gender and sex formation. The master-slash-slave dynamic, as fruitful as it is, can take us only so far in understanding how gender variance and gender fluidity have historically operated in the lives of enslaved persons. What I have had in mind this whole time is Luke and Jacobs together constituting a new and dynamic field of possibility. For they are not just anonymous actors in Jacobs's narrative, but historical antecedents to Sapphire, who enacts her old men in drag into Trudeau Harris's conception of the black male mammy who services white men on the plantation and during the Reconstruction era. In the slave past and still today, the gender-variant dyad of black male and female functions as an antidote of black experience, that dynamic that we have privately and silently acknowledged but have disavowed in all ways in the public domain. Hortense J. Spillers has, quite astutely, identified the politics of gender differentiation as central to black subject-making in the New World. Spillers conceives of the captivity in Africa and the Middle Passage as a theft of the body, a willful and violent severing of the captive body from its motive will, its active desire. She also equates this theft of the black body with the loss of gender identity for black people in the New World. Under these conditions, we lose at least gender difference in the outcome, and the female body and the male body become a territory of cultural and political maneuver, not at all gender-related, gender-specific. In the absence of gender specificity, of distinctive categories of gender, Spillers finds the enslaved black body functioning in European and white American imaginations as a category of otherness, the captive body translating into a potential for pornotripping and embodying sheer physical powerlessness that slides into a more general powerlessness, resonating through various centers of human and social meaning. Who can contest Spillers' spot-on analysis of gender ambiguity coinciding with white American conceptions of black animality, disfigurement, sexual taint, and the clandestine pornotripping that has characterized white erotic access to black bodies under slavery? Colonial-era whites constructed black, slave, chattel, and African to mean qualitatively nothing and virtually anything. These indeterminate categories whites then mapped onto black, male, and female bodies in overlapping and indiscriminate ways. Spillers' well-stated point is that this gender ambiguity mapped onto Negroid bodies helped concretize the exclusion of African Americans from the humane categories of mother, father, statesman, son, daughter, citizen, and so forth. The challenge, though, with what Spillers describes as the political imperative to differentiate between genders is that within African Americanist scholarship, this gender politics has contributed to a theoretical aversion to gender and sex instability. We have yet to fully develop or recover the ability to see black culture as positively constituted through a fluid gender and sex dynamic. For example, in Ain't I a Woman? Black Women and Feminism, Bell Hooks conceives of the masculinization of the black female and the demasculinization of the black male as primarily dysfunctional experiences that can only reveal to us the dynamics of sexist and racist oppression during slavery. Hooks, keeping to a strict understanding of black demasculinization as the loss of the phallus, of phallic might, asserts that while black men were not forced to assume a role colonial American society regarded as feminine, black women were forced to assume a masculine role. Hooks's rigid conception of gender forecloses, from the outset, any consideration of men such as Luke, who were effeminized and made to play a range of social roles that transgress normative gender roles. Angela E. Davis, in her pioneering scholarship on black women's roles during slavery, locates the idea of the genderless black female in plantation labor practices. Expediency governed the slaveholders' posture toward female slaves. When it was profitable to exploit them as if they were men, they were regarded, in effect, as genderless. Davis also equates the genderless black woman and female masculinity with the negative intentions of the master in the sense of the genderless black women as lacking power and social agency. Michelle Wallace has linked black cultural workers' long-standing aversion to gender and sex fluidity to 1980s radical black sexual politics. Describing the black homosexual as descending from black women raped during slavery, she writes, "The black homosexual is counter-revolutionary, 1, because he's being fucked and, 2, because he's being fucked by a white man. By so doing he reduces himself to the status of our black grandmothers who, as everyone knows, were fucked by white men all the time." As with Hooks, Wallace conceives of sexual variance within radical black experience as a reflection of the dynamics of sexist and racist oppression during slavery. How unfortunate that association with black female sexual violation under slavery would render black men in the late 20th century counter-revolutionary. This is exactly what I am talking about, the clear need that we see demonstrated in Wallace's commentary for a sex and gender politics that would allow the contemporary male homosexual to positively embody the powerful legacy of the sexually violated grandmothers under slavery. As it stands, during the time of Wallace's writing and still today, black men who embody the sexual genealogies of the black mother and grandmother suffer misrecognition and demonization within most arenas of black radical activity and thought. Trottier Harris, whom I quoted from earlier, excavates the reality of the black grandmotherly or mammy-like figure only as a means of demonstrating black men's emotionally emasculated relationships to white men, stemming back to slavery. In calling our attention to Luke and Jacobs as a prototypical, historically resonant pairing, I had in mind the implicit gender-variant pairings that have informed the logic of Harris, Hooks, Davis, or Spillers, who each, in her own way, construes gender variance and instability as a negative state to be corrected or transcended. In her discussion of gender, Spillers describes a transgendered Sapphire switching gender roles with her father. Sapphire enacts her old man in drag, just as her old man becomes Sapphire in outrageous caricature. Hooks pairs the improbable black male effeminate with masculinized black women on the plantation. Harris's notion of the black male mammy parallels black female powerlessness. It is the masculine connotations implied in the mammy role and black women in general that lends itself to donning or dragging by black men under slavery. Then there is Wallace's notion of black men who enact the sexual roles of raped maternal figures from slavery. Wallace also invokes, as a parallel structure, the masculinized black woman from the plantation. In a largely unacknowledged manner, these gender and sexually variant pairings have operated and continue to operate at the nexus of our conceptualizations of black bodies, sexes, gender expressions, and so forth that emerged out of slavery. As a pairing, Luke and Jacobs help us see the positive outcomes of theorizing gender fluidity. The variance and fluidity of Luke and Jacobs enable them to survive within a culture of human consumption. Luke's role of the male mammy facilitates his resistance to his master and reveals to us, in stark fashion, the deeper, often unseen dynamics of incest and emotional hunger charging the relation between master and slave. Although Jacobs provides ambiguous information about his erotic proclivities, we can and should still speculate about the ways in which, perhaps, Luke's erotic desire for men or for a specific man may have sustained him and made him resistant to his master's desires to erotically partake of and consume him. Likewise, with Jacobs, in maintaining so vehemently the narrative of her pursuit of motherhood, we have largely overlooked how an aggressive sexuality and masculinized female economy of reproduction defined her relationship to reproduction and her children. Perhaps, then, her pursuit of coital pleasure and the children that resulted are better thought of as expressions of her resistance to social consumption. Of course, if we follow this line of thinking, we have to think about Jacobs in all sorts of sexually knowledgeable and therefore unsexed capacities. In addition to her sexuality, there is also the genealogy of Jacobs's gender and black maternity, which I have already explained as rooted in the notion of male mistresses and masculinized white female appetite and aggression. It is time for us, as forward-thinking scholars of slavery, to get beyond our theoretical aversions to gender and sex variance under slavery. I have attempted to clarify, through the example of a variant Luke and Jacobs, that we still have much labor to do in the way of formally excavating and beginning to analyze the import of the gender-crossing, sexually fluid pairing.